was.
Everything's fine.
What's all this about? Apparently, the dinosaurs may have been removed on purpose by our ancestors from Mars. What?
You may wish to prepare yourselves for 3 conclusions. The moon is not what you think it is. Human beings may be Martians in exile, and what killed one world may now be moving towards this one. For this presentation, I will be speaking audibly, but I will slip into telepathy briefly. Talking wrinkles my skin and tires me out. Anyway, let's begin. The central figure behind this dossier is Dr. Jason Reza Jorjani, philosopher, historian of ideas, and author of works that attempt to connect ancient myth, state secrecy, and non-human intelligence into one coherent model. And he's a pretty sharp dresser, too. A little more style than some of you suits. The first thing you should understand is not merely what he argues, but the reaction to his work. He was not answered in the normal way. He was marginalized, removed, and treated as though the danger lay not in the argument, but in its circulation. That pattern matters. In politics, when a thesis is weak, institutions usually rebut it. When a thesis is destabilizing, institutions often seek to discredit the person presenting it. This slide frames the dossier as an intellectual threat assessment. Not because one man possesses all truth, but because he assembled lines of evidence that, taken together, challenge the permitted boundaries of history. For your purposes, the important question is this: why would a researcher working across mythology, intelligence history, and anomalous science provoke a response more consistent with containment than debate? That is the question that opens the file. The second claim is that a covert religious intelligence current has influenced official handling of the UFO phenomenon for more than a century. In this framework, elements within military and intelligence structures came to interpret anomalous encounters not as technological or extraterrestrial, but as demonic. Their aim, therefore, was not simply secrecy for security reasons, but suppression for theological reasons. You must appreciate the institutional danger of this. If individuals inside the state believe disclosure itself is spiritually catastrophic, then democratic oversight becomes impossible. Policy ceases to be guided by law or public interest and becomes guided by private, apocalyptic conviction. The dossier then turns to the late 19th century, especially the 1896 airship wave in the United States. What matters here is not only the sightings themselves, but the testimony surrounding them. Reports described advanced craft appearing before the public had any accepted technological framework for them. Even more striking are accounts of witnesses who seemed to deliver information in altered states and later had no memory of doing so. Giordani treats this as the first major American case of seeded disclosure. Information introduced into public consciousness through intermediaries who did not fully understand what they were conveying. If that interpretation is even partially correct, it means the phenomenon has never been merely about machines in the sky. It has involved perception, cognition, memory, and influence. That matters for government because once a phenomenon can affect not just sensors and hardware, but human awareness itself, the entire defense posture changes. The issue becomes psychotronic as much as physical. In that reading, federal involvement did not begin simply because strange craft were seen. It began because consciousness itself appeared vulnerable to intrusion. Now we move into mythology, because mythology in this dossier is treated as encoded memory. Giordani argues that major elements of Western sacred legend, Grail motifs, underworld initiation, heroic ascent, gifted weapons, divine feminine mediation, can be traced to an ancient Caucasian and Iranian mythic complex centered on a figure called Satana. This is not presented as mere literary comparison. It is presented as evidence that civilizational memory survives in symbolic form long after its historical setting is forgotten. The policy significance may not be obvious at first, but it is this. If myths preserve fragments of contact history, technological memory, or prior civilizational crises, then the old distinction between myth and intelligence becomes less stable than modern institutions assume. You are accustomed to thinking that the state handles facts, while religion and myth handle stories. This dossier challenges that division. Its claim is that stories may be the oldest classified archive on Earth. The modern aerospace age did not emerge only from engineering laboratories and military budgets. In several documented cases, key figures at the frontier of propulsion, rocketry, and contact research also operated in occult or ritual frameworks. Jack Parsons is the most famous example, a pioneer of rocketry and co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but also a man engaged in ceremonial attempts to contact non-human intelligences. For many policymakers, that sounds irrelevant or embarrassing. It is not. It suggests that some of the individuals closest to breakthrough aerospace ideas did not view consciousness, ritual, or non-human contact as peripheral. They viewed them as adjacent to the core problem. The dossier does not ask you to adopt their worldview. It asks you to notice the pattern. The boundary between advanced propulsion research and esoteric experimentation has historically been more porous than official narratives admit. That should prompt a serious question. Were these men merely eccentric, or were they exploring a real interface between mind, matter, and intelligence? The argument now becomes more specific. Based on Apollo-era interpretations, Jorjani describes the Moon not as uniformly solid, but as possessing a comparatively thin outer crust over a vast internal hollow zone. In his framework, this is not a curiosity, it is architecture. That would imply the Moon is either a vessel, a station, or a megastructure repurposed into orbit. Why does that matter politically? Because every strategic doctrine on Earth assumes the Moon is inert terrain. If it is instead a constructed object, then our assumptions about sovereignty, cislunar space, deterrence, and off-world infrastructure are fundamentally obsolete. The dossier also links this alleged interior design to the Moon's extraordinary orbital stability. An object placed with deliberate engineering precision is a very different geopolitical reality than an object that arrived by chance. To put it plainly, if the Moon is artificial, then humanity has been conducting policy beneath a permanently stationed superior installation without admitting that fact. Giordani points to unusually shallow, wide lunar craters and to basin geometries that he believes are more consistent with impacts striking a hard underlying shell than with impacts into deep natural rock. His interpretation is that the visible lunar regolith may function as a covering over something metallic or engineered beneath it. Again, the immediate issue for you is not whether every crater analysis is correct. It is whether the anomalies, taken cumulatively with the seismic data, justify a classified review far more serious than the topic has received in public. A political audience should understand this in familiar terms. One anomaly can be dismissed. Multiple converging anomalies require institutional attention. The dossier argues that the Moon is not a passive body marked by impacts over time. It is an object whose visible damage patterns may be revealing the contours of a hidden construction. The next anomaly concerns mass concentrations, regions beneath the lunar surface that produce gravitational irregularities. The crucial point in Jorjani's analysis is geometric regularity. He emphasizes that these concentrations are circular rather than chaotic, and therefore look less like accidental density variations and more like embedded structures. He interprets them as dormant engineered systems, possibly transport-capable or related to gravity manipulation. For a statesman, this raises immediate implications. If there are concealed systems under the lunar surface generating measurable effects, then the moon is not merely a historical curiosity. It is active infrastructure with latent capability. This would transform how major powers approach lunar return missions. Exploration would no longer be about prestige or science alone. It would be contact management, threat assessment, and access control. In other words, what appears to be a question of geophysics may in fact be a question of dormant strategic assets. This slide addresses testimony and behavioral aftermath. The Dossier cites claims that Apollo astronauts encountered large craft or presences on or near the lunar surface, and that private communications captured fear, warning, and immediate recognition that they were not alone. Whether every reported quote is authentic is not the sole issue here. The deeper issue is pattern recognition, abrupt loss of lunar momentum, the absence of sustained return missions, and the unusual affect displayed by astronauts after the mission. Jorjani reads this as evidence that Apollo did not simply succeed. It crossed a threshold and encountered an occupying intelligence that did not welcome prolonged human presence. If correct, then the post-Apollo retreat was not budgetary theater. It was a managed withdrawal after contact. For policymakers, this would be among the most significant concealed episodes in modern history. The first state-level human approach to off-world infrastructure, followed by containment and silence. The Dossier then proposes a mechanism for silence, trauma suppression, and memory disruption. Jorjani points to the emotional flattening, broken relationships, and altered public behavior of returning astronauts, and suggests that, beyond trauma itself, active suppression techniques may have been used to contain what they experienced. You need not accept that exact mechanism to grasp the institutional logic. If a state encountered evidence of a superior non-human presence and believed the information could destabilize society, elite decision-makers might rationalize extraordinary interventions. The result would be familiar to those who study traumatic secrecy: dissociation, inability to narrate experience, family disintegration, and a public record marked by incompleteness. This is not merely about individual suffering. It would mean the modern security state crossed from managing information to altering persons. That is a moral threshold as well as a political one. Now the Dossier shifts from American secrecy to great power behavior. The Soviet Union competed fiercely in the space race, yet stepped back from a full lunar confrontation. Jorjani interprets this not as technical failure alone, but as strategic reassessment after determining the moon was occupied or dangerous. He further argues that knowledge once held by Soviet systems may have been transferred in part to China. That matters because it reframes today's lunar competition. You are accustomed to reading Sino-Russian alignment in terrestrial terms: energy, trade, military balancing, anti-Western coordination. This dossier suggests there may be another layer: shared strategic understanding of the off-world environment. If that is true, then current lunar developments are not just another chapter in space competition. They are the resumption of a long-suspended approach to a controlled object in orbit. For elected leaders, that possibility deserves sober attention. This slide takes the geopolitical argument to its sharpest edge. Jorjani's claim is that China's rise in lunar ambition may not be based solely on technological confidence or national prestige. It may reflect an expectation of managed access. In plainer terms, he suggests that some terrestrial powers may be viewed as more compatible counterparts by whatever intelligence occupies the moon. Why would that be? Because centralized, surveillance-capable, disciplined systems are easier to negotiate with than pluralistic republics full of competing authorities and uncontrolled publics. You do not have to endorse this conclusion to appreciate its strategic significance. If non-human intelligence prefers predictability, then modern authoritarian models may hold advantages that democracies have not even begun to calculate. That would make off-world diplomacy inseparable from domestic governance style. It would also mean that the future balance of power on Earth could be shaped by criteria that humanity did not establish. We now leave the Moon and turn to Mars. This section draws heavily on declassified remote viewing material, especially sessions in which trained intelligence assets were tasked, blind, to examine ancient Mars. The descriptions included monumental ruins, pyramidal structures, underground architecture, and the remnants of a civilization facing collapse. Many of you will instinctively resist this because the method involves consciousness-based intelligence collection. That is understandable. But the Dossier's argument is cumulative. When remote viewing, planetary anomalies, and later scientific findings appeared to converge, the method cannot be dismissed solely because it is unconventional. From a policy standpoint, the point is not to replace empirical science with psychic methods. The point is to ask whether intelligence agencies spent years exploring such methods because they were useless, or because they sometimes worked. If the Mars material is even partially valid, then we are looking at evidence of a prior technologically advanced civilization in our own solar system. That alone would reorder human history. In those Mars sessions, the beings described were humanoid, tall, physically refined, and visibly in crisis. They were not depicted as conquerors in triumph, but as a civilization under terminal pressure, searching for an exit. This matters because the Dossier frames Mars not just as a dead world, but as a precedent, a warning. The essential image is of a species technologically advanced enough to build monumental infrastructure, yet unable to solve the final systems-level problem that confronted it. It searched, scouted, calculated, and still failed. For policymakers, historical analogy is one of the most useful tools available. The Dossier offers a cosmic analogy. Another civilization may have reached a level of complexity, information density, and planetary stress beyond what it could sustainably manage. If so, then Mars is not just archaeology. It is scenario planning. The next step is where the Dossier seeks hard scientific reinforcement. Drawing on the work of nuclear physicist John Brandenburg, Jorjani argues that isotope anomalies in the Cydonia region of Mars are most consistent with large-scale thermonuclear events. In effect, Mars may not merely have died. It may have been violently damaged by nuclear-level destruction. This is politically important because isotope analysis belongs to a domain governments already trust. Nuclear forensics underpins modern monitoring and treaty verification. The Dossier therefore attempts to bridge the unconventional and the conventional, remote-viewed ruins, then isotopic signatures, ancient catastrophe, then measurable residue. Its interpretation is severe. A civilization on Mars reached crisis, concentrated immense destructive force in a core region, and failed to save itself. If true, Mars is not only a dead planet. It is a policy memorandum written in fallout. The Dossier now fuses the lunar and Martian narratives. Its thesis is that the Moon is not native to Earth, but was placed into orbit by surviving Martian intelligence as part of a long-term terraforming and biosphere stabilization project. The much-discussed eclipse ratio, the apparent mathematical elegance of lunar and solar geometry, is treated here not as coincidence, but as intentional signature. Again, the burden is not on you to accept every detail at once. The burden is to think strategically. If one civilization relocated or repurposed a megastructure to prepare another world for habitation, then planetary engineering is not science fiction. It is precedent. That would place humanity inside a designed environment, one whose stabilizing features we mistake for nature because they preceded our remembered history. This is a radical idea, yes. But it is radical in exactly the way policymakers should take seriously. It alters the background assumptions behind every human institution. This is the emotional and civilizational hinge of the dossier. The claim is not simply that Martians existed. It is that humanity may descend from survivors or remnant populations linked to that world, and that the Moon was instrumental in making Earth suitable for our continuity. The dossier points to Earth's axial stability, tides, seasonal regularity, and long-term environmental moderation as part of a deliberate biospheric intervention. Politically, this would mean nations, ethnicities, and modern identities are all surface phenomena layered atop a much older common origin. Humanity's deepest ancestry would not be terrestrial in the simple sense we presently teach. I understand the magnitude of that statement, but consider its implications. A species that believes itself native, accidental, and divided behaves one way. A species that realizes it is relocated, unfinished, and historically warned behaves another. The dossier is pressing toward the second possibility. The next claim is that Earth's pre-human biosphere may have been strategically altered. Jorjani interprets the extinction-level event that ended the age of dinosaurs as more than random catastrophe. In his model, it functioned as a clearing operation, removing dominant apex life so that a future resettlement could occur. Now, such a claim is understandably difficult, but the dossier's logic is sequential. Mars falls, the Moon arrives, Earth is stabilized. Major biological obstacles are removed, a suitable environment emerges, humanity appears. He calls this not an accident chain, but a project timeline. As policymakers, you need not affirm the entire sequence, but you should recognize the seriousness of the proposition. The Earth may have been intentionally prepared for us. That would mean human history begins not with primitive emergence from chaos, but with the aftermath of a controlled planetary transition. The dossier then returns to corroboration. Independent remote viewing efforts reportedly identified not just ruins on Mars, but surviving subterranean systems, residual infrastructure, and active relay or beacon-like functions. This matters because the Mars case is not presented as fully dead archaeology. It is presented as partially persistent intelligence infrastructure. If that is so, then Mars is not simply a tomb. It is a damaged node that may still be transmitting, recording, or waiting. That raises an uncomfortable but practical point for governance. If there are still operational remnants of a prior civilization within our solar system, then our species is not alone even in the aftermath of ancient collapse. In policy terms, that is no longer history. It is environment. Now the dossier turns from archaeology to ontology. Giordani proposes that reality behaves like a bounded information system, one that appears to optimize or render in relation to observation. He draws on information theory, thermodynamics, and quantum interpretation to suggest that consciousness and physical reality are more entangled than materialist models admit. This is not just metaphysical speculation within the logic of the presentation. It is the explanatory bridge connecting remote viewing, psionics, observer effects, and advanced non-human technology. Why does this matter politically? Because if reality is informational at depth, then power will increasingly belong not only to those who control territory and industry, but to those who understand consciousness as an operational variable. The modern state is built on industrial assumptions about matter. The dossier suggests the next threshold belongs to civilizations that understand information and mind as the true substrate. That would mean the strategic revolution ahead is deeper than artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, or quantum computing. It concerns the architecture of reality itself. This slide introduces a seemingly abstract idea with catastrophic consequences. Landauer's principle shows that information processing has irreducible physical effects. Jorjani extends this to argue that data is not metaphorically physical, but physically consequential in mass energy terms. The implication is extraordinary. As civilizations accumulate data, they are not merely storing symbols. They are participating in a process with measurable material cost. Now place that inside a world whose digital output grows exponentially. For politicians, this is where the dossier stops being cosmic speculation and starts resembling long-range infrastructure warning. If information has mass consequences, then endless digital expansion is not a neutral trend. It may have physical thresholds. Civilizations tend to assume that what is virtual is weightless. This dossier argues the opposite. The virtual may be the next great burden-bearing layer of material reality. The dossier then makes one of its boldest interpretive moves. Dark matter, the invisible mass inferred from galactic behavior, is recast as accumulated information mass, the computational residue of civilizations that crossed certain developmental thresholds. You may regard that as a speculative leap. Fair enough. But notice what the argument is doing. It is treating cosmology not as disconnected from civilization, but as partly composed of civilizational aftermath. In that view, the universe is not empty theater. It is layered with the residues of intelligence, memory, and systemic failure. Why should policymakers care? Because it transforms the question of sustainability. The danger facing a technological civilization may not end at local collapse. Its residue may enter the fabric of cosmic structure itself. The dossier is saying, in effect, that civilizations leave massed traces in reality, not only monuments or atmospheres, but informational gravity. This is the warning slide. Using continued exponential data growth, Jorjani projects a future in which information mass reaches physically catastrophic thresholds. In his framing, server infrastructure eventually becomes a planetary hazard, not figuratively, but gravitationally and geophysically. Whether his timeline is exact is less important than the structure of the warning. A civilization that treats data growth as inherently good, inherently immaterial, and indefinitely scalable may be moving toward a hard ceiling it does not yet perceive. Politicians are familiar with delayed systemic dangers, debt accumulation, ecological overshoot, demographic imbalance. This dossier proposes a new one, computational overshoot. And it does something more unsettling. It links that overshoot to the fate of Mars. In other words, the dossier does not simply say we are in danger. It says we may be repeating a known civilizational failure mode. The next conclusion is grim. Jorjani suggests the nuclear destruction on Mars was not primarily warfare between rivals, but an attempted emergency response, a desperate effort to reduce information burden quickly enough to avert planetary catastrophe. In this reading, the Martians did not destroy themselves out of hatred. They destroyed parts of their own infrastructure in a last effort to survive a systems collapse they understood too late. That interpretation gives the dossier its full, tragic force. Mars becomes not a morality tale about aggression alone, but about intelligence outrunning wisdom. For policymakers, this is perhaps the most practical lesson in the entire presentation. Advanced societies do not only die from enemies, they die from scaling forces they themselves normalize until intervention is no longer possible. That is the meaning of the Martian precedent. This slide returns us to the present. The dossier argues that the UFO phenomenon cannot be disclosed honestly without also disclosing the role of consciousness, telepathy, and psionic interaction. Why? Because advanced craft and advanced intelligences may not operate through purely mechanical interfaces. This is critical for government. It means the state may have suppressed not one secret, but two inseparable ones: non-human technology and the mind's role in engaging it. That would explain why so many public discussions remain incomplete. They present hardware without operator theory, sightings without interface logic, and security concerns without acknowledging the consciousness dimension. But if consciousness is intrinsic to the phenomenon, then future aerospace, intelligence, and defense systems may not be fully understandable within current scientific bureaucracy. That is not merely a scientific problem, it is a governance problem. Here the dossier becomes more operational. It proposes that certain advanced craft are not flown through conventional controls, but through direct integration between pilot and vehicle. In such a system, the craft is not merely used by the operator, it is coupled to the operator's mind. This explains, within the dossier's framework, why psychic interference would be dangerous, and why crashes might occur without conventional mechanical failure. For policymakers, the importance is clear. Any recovered technology of this type would not simply be a machine awaiting reverse engineering. It would require a revolution in human factors, cognition, selection, training, and bioethical oversight. It would also mean that national advantage in aerospace may eventually depend as much on consciousness research as on metallurgy or electronics. That is an unfamiliar proposition, but many strategic revolutions are unfamiliar before they become obvious. The final mechanism of secrecy described in the dossier is psychological fracture. Giordani argues that those tasked with carrying the deepest knowledge of origin, contact, and non-human technology become split internally by the burden of contradiction. They must inhabit ordinary social life while guarding a radically different underlying reality. Over time, such compartmentalization ceases to be merely organizational. It becomes psychic. That would produce a shadow governance problem more dangerous than conspiracy in the cartoon sense. Not evil masterminds, but fractured custodians, people managing immense secrets without the integrated moral clarity needed to wield them responsibly. From a political perspective, this is a profound warning. The longer civilization-defining truths are kept outside lawful, accountable discourse, the more pathological the institutions of secrecy become. Secrets do not only hide reality, they deform the people assigned to carry them. The dossier's geopolitical conclusion is stark. It suggests that if non-human intelligence is managing long-term outcomes on Earth, it may favor governance systems built on control, surveillance, predictability, and centralized execution. Such systems are easier to coordinate, easier to negotiate with, and easier to stabilize from above. That possibility would cast current global trends in a different light. The spread of surveillance architectures, behavioral monitoring, digital compliance systems, and technocratic control could be interpreted not only as human political evolution, but as convergence toward a governance format suitable for external management. Whether you accept that fully or not, the question it raises is urgent. What kinds of political systems are compatible with human freedom under conditions of radical external pressure? Because if the future is being shaped in favor of total management, then constitutional self-government is not merely an internal political preference. It becomes a civilizational line of defense. The dossier ends, perhaps surprisingly, not in despair, but in possibility. Its final claim is that humanity is unfinished, not defective, unfinished. The danger is real, the warnings are ancient, the pattern may be repeating, but the outcome is not fixed. That is the Promethean element. the belief that intelligence can still evolve beyond the trap that consumed prior civilizations. Not by accelerating the same path blindly, and not by submitting to managed containment, but by developing forms of consciousness, culture, governance, and technical restraint that exceed the old ceiling. This is why the dossier matters, not because every proposition is comfortable, but because it insists that the warning exists for a reason. A civilization that receives a warning and changes course is not the same as a civilization that never saw it coming. That difference may be everything. Thank you for your attention. You have all behaved with considerably more dignity than the historical average for your species.